no offense, but you ever had yourself checked for Tourette's? What? Tourette's syndrome. Seriously.
There is a specific episode in the final season where Tony takes Paulie out on a boat and comes super close to killing him. He never does it. But the tension in that scene is real, and when you notice it, you start wondering what actually would have happened if he had gone through with it. You almost feel kinda bad as he understands where this was going. I'm going to walk through 3 different ways this could have played out: quiet, chaotic, and personal, and each one ends up costing Tony something he does not see coming. By the end, I think you will understand why Paulie surviving that boat trip might be one of the most important moments in the whole final season, even though almost nothing visibly happens in it. At first, it sounds like one of those alternate endings that would change a single episode and leave everything else more or less intact. Paulie disappears in Florida, Tony comes home alone, everyone understands what probably happened, and the story moves on. But here's the thing. By the final season, the family is already being held together by habit, fear, and a shrinking number of men who remember what the family used to be. Killing Paulie would remove more than an annoying soldier. It would remove one of the last living connections between Tony, Johnny Boy Jr., and the older version of North Jersey that Tony has spent his entire life trying to inherit. The immediate problem might disappear. The damage would keep spreading long after the boat returned to shore. The suspicion Tony has in Remember When is completely justified. Paulie told Johnny Sack about Ralph's joke about Ginny. He passed along Jersey business that allowed Johnny to learn things he could use against Tony. He did all of this because he felt ignored while he was in prison, resented Ralph's rise, and convinced himself that Johnny was preparing a real place for him in New York. That fantasy collapsed the moment Carmine met Paulie in person and had absolutely no idea who he was.
What's your name again?
Paulie Gualtieri. Johnny talked to you about me, right?
Johnny who? Sack? Talk to me about what?
Paulie finally understood that Johnny had been flattering him for information and embarrassingly little else. He came back emotionally to Tony's side, but the betrayal had already happened, and Tony never really stopped wondering who had opened the door. That old suspicion is sitting alongside a newer and more immediate fear. A body connected to Tony's first murder has surfaced, forcing him and Paulie to leave New Jersey. Paulie should be useful in this situation. He was there when Tony was young, he knew Johnny Boy, and he understands how to keep his head down when things get serious. Instead, he talks to strangers, tells stories, and treats what is supposed to be laying low like a road trip through the old days. Tony watches him give away details to anyone willing to listen, and every joke starts sounding like evidence. Every memory becomes another thing Paulie could repeat in the wrong room at the wrong time. The trip also strips away whatever sentimental version of their relationship Tony had left. Paulie remembers Tony being born. He remembers Johnny Boy crying. He tells Tony that his father trusted him enough to give him the job of this first murder. These stories should make Tony feel close to him, and in some ways they do. They also place Paulie inside parts of Tony's life that Tony cannot control. Paulie knows where the family came from. He knows how frightened Tony once was. He remembers Johnny Boy as an actual man rather than the legend Tony carries in his head. The longer Paulie talks, the more Tony is sitting across from a witness who may have outlived his usefulness. Once the legal threat disappears, Tony suddenly suggests sport fishing. That decision tells you everything you need to know about what the boat trip is actually about. He has already told Beansy that Paulie concerns him, that he wonders whether Paulie's loyalty has ever really been tested. On the water, Tony keeps circling back to the Ginny Sack joke.
Thought I saw a whale. Oh shit. Let me think of Ginny Sack.
He tries humor, he tries pressure, he tries a fake promise that a confession would be no big deal.
Was you told him, right? It's no big deal. I could hardly resist.
Paulie refuses every time. Tony looks at the weapons on the boat and tests how close he can move toward the decision without openly announcing it. This is the same kind of private space where Pussy was killed, except Tony has no wire, no confession, and no proof beyond a conclusion he has probably been sitting with for years. So what happens if he goes through with it? There are really 3 versions of this, and each one ends up punishing Tony in a different way. The first is the quiet version. Tony returns to Jersey, says nothing directly to Paulie, and gives Silvio the order. This would be the clean managerial choice. Silvio could arrange a meeting, send Paulie somewhere isolated, and make the disappearance look unrelated to Florida. Paulie has no wife or children demanding answers. His legitimate income is basically nothing. His personal life is almost entirely contained inside the crew. From a practical standpoint, he is easier to erase than almost anyone else. Silvio would probably follow the order, though this would bother him more than a standard hit. He understands Paulie's flaws. He knows the mouth is dangerous. He also knows Paulie has survived wars, arrests, changes in leadership, and decades of service. Tony would have to give Silvio a clear explanation because Silvio is the man who turns Tony's emotional decisions into something that functions as family policy. If the explanation is only that Tony has a feeling, Silvio still obeys, but something quietly shifts between them. He now knows that a senior captain can be removed over an old suspicion that was never proven. The crew would not need official confirmation. Paulie goes to Florida with Tony and does not come back. Everyone would understand. They already suspect Tony killed Ralph, and they know people around him have a habit of disappearing after private meetings. Ralph's death could be defended as punishment for constant chaos. Pussy was an informant. Tony Blendetto had pushed New York toward a war that could have destroyed everything. Paulie's case is harder to explain because his betrayal is old, his recent behavior is irritating rather than openly treasonous, and Tony had continued accepting his envelopes for years without acting. That distinction matters in a way Tony would underestimate. A boss can be feared for killing traitors. He becomes unstable when his men believe history can be rewritten whenever he gets angry enough. Carlo would start looking at Tony differently. Patsy already carries the memory of his twin brother's murder. Christopher would understand that years of service provide no real protection. Bobby, who still believes in the rules more sincerely than most of them, would see that the rules are whatever Tony needs during a bad week. Nobody challenges Tony directly. They protect themselves quietly instead, earn less honestly, hide money, make outside contacts, and quietly prepare for the possibility that they are next. Christopher's position would also shift in a way Tony could not predict. In the show as it exists, Paulie's feud with Christopher helps push Christopher back toward humiliation, alcohol, and the final collapse of whatever loyalty remained between them. Remove Paulie and one of those pressures disappears. Christopher might last longer. He might even still be alive when New York attacks. That sounds useful until you remember what kind of soldier Christopher has become by that point. He is capable of violence, but he is also bitter, addicted, and increasingly willing to speak about the family through movies and drunken confessions. Tony might spare Paulie only to find himself more dependent on the more dangerous man. Every version of this punishes Tony the same way. He keeps treating people as individual problems when the entire structure is failing. Paulie's mouth, Christopher's addiction, Carlo's fear, Patsy's resentment, Bobby's inexperience, and Silvio's limits are all connected. Removing one man cannot restore the old family. It only shifts the pressure onto whoever remains. By the time Tony understands that, his choices have already been reduced to a group of men he mistrusts for different reasons, all watching to see whether loyalty is rewarded, tolerated, or eventually used as evidence against them. The family could survive that atmosphere while Silvio is healthy and New York stays manageable. The real collapse comes later. Christopher dies. Bobby is killed. Silvio is left in a coma. Carlo turns government witness. In the series as it exists, Paulie is one of the few experience-made men still standing when Tony tries to rebuild after all of that. Tony offers him the old Ralph crew because there is almost nobody senior left. Remove Paulie in Florida, and the final version of North Jersey is even thinner. Tony is left with Patsy, younger soldiers, and men who have never carried the family through a serious crisis. Paulie survives because he knows when to hide, when to flatter, when to accept less, and when to avoid becoming important enough to be targeted. New York goes after Tony, Silvio, and Bobby because they represent the leadership structure. Paulie gets left alone because he appears manageable. After the war, that actually makes him useful. Killing him in Florida would give Tony emotional relief in exchange for removing one of the only men New York might tolerate during any kind of transition. The second version of this begins when Paulie senses the danger before Tony can act, and honestly, this is very believable, because Paulie survives by reading small changes in powerful men. On the boat, he already understands what Tony is considering. His nervous laugh changes. He watches Tony's movements. He refuses to admit the joke even when Tony promises nothing will happen, because Paulie knows that confession is permission. If he returns to Jersey believing the subject is unfinished, his first instinct is self-preservation. Johnny Sack is dead by this point. Carmine Sr. is gone. The New York connection Paulie once imagined has completely vanished. Phil is rising, and Paulie would have to approach a leadership group that does not respect him. The move would be humiliating, but death is more humiliating. Paulie could offer what he has always offered, information. He knows Tony's routines, the structure of the Jersey crews, the location of businesses, the emotional weaknesses inside the family, and the people most likely to follow orders. He also knows Tony is under pressure from a murder investigation. New York would listen because information is cheap and useful. They would not suddenly treat Paulie as an equal. Phil already views Tony's family as a glorified crew and has little patience for Jersey. A senior Jersey captain arriving with proof that Tony wants him dead would support everything Phil already believes about Tony having no real respect for tradition or stability. Paulie could describe the Ginny Sack leak as a misunderstanding and present himself as a loyal old soldier being sacrificed by an insecure boss. Phil would enjoy that story because it makes Tony look exactly like the man he already considers him to be. Tony's response would make the situation worse. He could not publicly admit that Paulie ran because Tony had planned to kill him over information given to Johnny years earlier. He would call Paulie a thief, a traitor, a deserter. He would demand New York return him. Phil would refuse because holding Paulie gives him leverage and embarrasses Tony publicly. The dispute over one frightened captain would attach itself to every other unresolved issue between them, and Phil's permanent sense that Jersey has escaped the consequences it deserves. This version could start the war earlier and make it worse. Paulie would become the spark, though he would never control the fire. With Paulie explaining Tony's habits and locations, the first attacks could be cleaner and faster. Tony's side would still have Christopher alive, which gives Jersey another capable killer, but Christopher's addiction and resentment make him unreliable in exactly the situations that matter most. Paulie's knowledge could cancel out the advantage of having more men. There is also a darker possibility in this version. New York could keep Paulie alive as the face of whatever remains after Tony is removed. He is old, familiar, and easy to pressure. He has already shown that flattery can move him. He could collect money in Jersey while New York absorbs the real profits, but that arrangement would probably be temporary. Once his information has been used, Phil or Butchie would have little reason to protect a man who has already betrayed two families. Paulie might escape Tony only to discover that New York sees him as a disposable witness to its own plans. His most likely ending in this version is death from one side or the other, and the attempt to survive would have accelerated the conflict without giving him anywhere safe to land. The third version is the most personal. Tony confronts Paulie directly on the boat, pushes harder, and forces the conversation past hints. This gives Paulie a chance to do what he has always done when cornered: talk. He could remind Tony that he served Johnny Boy before Tony was old enough to understand the business. He could list the years he spent earning, the prison time he accepted without complaining, the murders he committed, and the times he followed orders without asking whether they were fair. He could blame Johnny Sack for manipulating him while Tony was ignoring him. He could say he was lonely, angry, and stupid. Every part of that would be true. It still would not save him if he admitted the leak. Tony has brought him onto open water because he wants certainty, and a confession would turn suspicion into a punishable offense. Once Tony has that explanation, killing Paulie becomes something he can place inside the rules of the life and call it business. Paulie understands this better than Tony expects. His refusal is actually the smartest decision he makes in the entire episode. He lies directly and holds the lie while Tony becomes more threatening. For once, the man who is famous for talking refuses to give away the one piece of information that would kill him. Tony is testing whether Paulie can keep a secret, and Paulie passes by, keeping the secret Tony already believes he knows. That is why Tony spares him. Affection matters, history matters, Paulie's connection to Johnny Boy matters, his usefulness matters, but the decisive thing is that Tony cannot get the certainty he came looking for. Pussy had a wire and eventually admitted everything on a different boat in a different season. Christopher gave Tony a crushed baby seat, drugs in his system, and years of broken promises accumulating in the same direction. Tony Blundetto had started a conflict that genuinely threatened to destroy the whole operation. With Paulie, Tony has a pattern, a strong suspicion, and a deep personal irritation. He does not have the clean piece of evidence that lets him call murder a responsible decision. There is also something else worth noticing. Tony tells Beansy things are going well for once, and that he may be waiting for the other shoe to drop. Paulie becomes that other shoe. He is loud, old, repetitive, lonely, and impossible to fully control. He reminds Tony of his father, of his first murder, of his own age, and of the future waiting for men who give their entire lives to the family. Killing him would silence all of that for a few minutes. It would not make Tony safer. When Paulie sends the expensive gift afterward, Carmela asks what is wrong with him. Tony answers that men like Paulie are what allow their lifestyle to exist. That line is Tony restoring the business argument after he almost destroyed it himself. Paulie is ridiculous, compromised, and dangerous. He is also loyal in the only way these men can still understand loyalty. He lies, flatters, steals, complains, and comes back with an envelope. Tony finally accepts that this may be the strongest form of loyalty his world can still produce. Had Tony killed Paulie, the family would have become weaker sooner. The men around him would have trusted him less, and New York would have found a more fragile structure to break. Had Paulie run, he could have turned Tony's private suspicion into an open war. Had he confessed, he would have died on the boat and given Tony another murder he could explain to himself as necessary. Paulie survives because he denies Tony that explanation. Tony did not spare an innocent man. He spared a guilty man whose guilt could not be safely separated from Tony's own fear, resentment, and need for control. Paulie walked off that boat because he understood the rule that had already killed better men than him. When Tony asks for the truth is rarely what saves you. The refusal is.